Labor appears to be inching closer to some sort of solution to the current crisis of energy prices across the nation, but it's been a long time coming, and in recent weeks we've heard the word complex from, for example, the Treasurer Jim Chalmers, the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, on why this hasn't been solved earlier. It is a complex area. To break it all down, joining me now is Grattan Institute's Energy and Climate Change Program Director, Tony Wood. Thanks very much for your time. Why don't we just split the two areas out? So coal, first of all, seems to be causing the big stash with states. What's happening here? If the federal government wants to just set a cap price on coal, that's to reduce how much we're paying in electricity prices in the coal aspect. Why is that an issue? Would state governments deserve compensation? Would companies, coal companies, what could happen here?
Well, I guess this has opened up a big difference between the Commonwealth and the states. The Commonwealth arguably, and apparently New South Wales government at least has advice on, would impose some form of price cap on some part of the coal industry. And I say some part twice because it is messy how they would actually do it. The concern is that if the Commonwealth does that, it may be that they would be open to claims by the coal producers for compensation or revenue they'll otherwise get from selling that coal at very high prices. Now, if the government constrains that only to the coal that's being provided into the spot market in Australia, that may be less of an issue. But given that Queensland owns their old coal-fired generators, and both states, New South Wales and Queensland, get royalties from coal, if the price for coal was to come down, they might feel that their treasuries, if not their consumers, are suffering as a result of lower coal prices, and they might want compensation. And the generators who've been making potentially a lot of money at the moment because of the high electricity prices, and they've got long-term low-price contracts, they might also not like it if some of those big profits were taken from them as well. So that's why I think this is getting messy, particularly when the word compensation starts to appear.
Yeah, that if the billions that are saving by consumers is footed by the federal government, suddenly the story today about extra revenue coming in is diluted somewhat. So the options seem to be the federal government goes somewhat nuclear and says, well, look, super profits are being made, we'll get some sort of tax in place. They don't seem to appear to have the willingness for the fight on that, or at least make sure domestic coal use, the coal that's going into our power stations in Australia, does have a capped price on it. Is that something that others would sort of make peace with, do you think?
Oh, look, I think and that opens up an interesting overlap between what the government's been talking about on gas, where they do have at least the potential for doing something like that. There's not much doubt, Tom, that, as you said in your introduction, this is a very messy, complex problem. There's no simple answer that everybody gets what they want. The challenge here is to get the worst bad outcome, something that everybody can live with, and that I suspect means some pretty serious negotiations, like very, very soon, to be able to get something in place by the end of this year.
That's coal, and that matters, of course, because if you sort out gas, then coal could end up being the spot price. If you like the spot price, is what energy prices essentially set out across the network. So what about gas, though? Is this simpler for the federal government in terms of compensation, but just, again, how much they're willing to take up the fight and fight back against talk of sovereign risk or whatever else that comes from gas companies? Because, again, you're talking about an incredibly high international price we as consumers are paying for an asset that Australian taxpayers should own.
Yeah, look, that's been also the other challenge, is that arguably the petroleum resource rent tax has not been biting particularly hard on those companies. The difference between gas and coal is at least that, partly courtesy of the previous coalition government, when Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister, introduced a mechanism by which the government was able to work with the LNG producers, and there's only three big joint ventures in Queensland that export this gas we're talking about. They'd come to the table, and effectively would be compelled to provide gas to the domestic market on the east coast of Australia, so we wouldn't run out of gas, which had been a concern. Now, that system has worked reasonably well, and so far we haven't run out of gas, although, Victoria might have a problem in the next couple of years for other reasons. Now, that mechanism has been working, but it doesn't have a price trigger in it, partly because the Prime Minister at the time, and nobody else saw this Ukraine war happening, and that's what's driven up the price. And so it's that quantum of gas, that amount of gas that is being sold into the domestic market by the LNG producers, only a relatively small percentage of their total volume. And if the government can do a deal in which those producers still get the high prices on the international market and it doesn't interfere with their long-term contracts, I think the arguments for sovereign risk tend to fall away a lot. And the government could end up being able to do a deal here in which they only have an arrangement on price, which applies to that last bit of gas. But it's that last bit of gas, which you just said is almost unwateringly high price, that's affecting the electricity price. If that came down, it would also mean that the price that the coal generators can get would also come down, because it's gas that's been almost setting the cap on the price.
Well, yeah, because when we hear sovereign risk, the particular concern raised as well, contracts were entered into. Companies did this drilling, they did so on the basis that the regulatory environment would be the same. But when you think of the big contracts signed sort of 2012, 2013 in Queensland, we're talking at the time, the price $4, $5, now it's up to $10 in terms of a gigajoule. Now it's up to, $20, $30, $40, and the cap spoken about might be $10 or $12. So am I missing something? Is it more complex than that, or is this just companies going, hey, we're making a lot of money, we don't want to make any less?
Yeah, and I think the fact that this is taking so long, and I think because the government has to pick through some pretty tricky issues, explains why. But whilst you have this long time where there's no final decision, it does open up the space for a lot of debate around how bad it's going to be. Now, I think the experience here, and I absolutely understand why the companies would argue against any sort of constraint on their pricing. But the government can do it so it doesn't affect those long-term contracts that they enter into in good faith. It should be at a price that wouldn't discourage new exploration in Australia. There's other reasons why we might not want more gas, but that's a different story. Then you've got some chance of achieving that. So I think that's the sweet spot the government needs to aim for, because it would be on very strong political grounds, but also on social and economic grounds, because even the Treasury has told the government, look, there are good grounds here, because these are literally windfall profits that these companies are making. They're not profits they in any way anticipated when they did what, as you described, when they entered into their contracts.
Yeah, that last one's a good point. Just finally and very briefly, that's the sweet spot. I guess it's the easy thing. The federal government wouldn't think it'd have too much trouble doing that. Do they go further, redo the PRRT and actually get the sort of money out of these super profits that other exporting countries do?
Well, I think the review of the petroleum resource rent tax was put in place by the previous government. I think Josh Frydenberg is Treasurer, and the current Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, has said he's waiting on that advice. Now, I don't know what the timetable of that advice would be, Tom, but I think that's coming pretty soon. And I would be surprised if there weren't some pretty substantial changes. Now, that will not be pretty either. The government, Frydenberg, when he was in government, he put in place some arrangements which stopped new gas projects taking advantage of some very weak conditions in the petroleum resource rent tax. They may want to go further than that. Whatever they do to go further will absolutely generate pushback from the coal producers, and they will raise all sorts of concerns as to how bad that could be. And so again, you could imagine another big negotiation, in this case, probably in the new year.
All right, do part one first of all. Not sure they'll have the stomach for part two. We'll see. Tony Wood, great to get your thoughts on this complex debate that swirls around, and keep that in mind as you have various lobby groups in your faces over the next few months.